All right, guys, we got a little bit of a lens battle here for you today. We've got two 42.5 millimeter lenses, 85 millimeter equivalent. One's an f.95, one's an f1.2. Which one's better? Let's find out. So let's look at build quality first. I originally got this 42.5 in order to be a good match for my little 25 millimeter 0.95 Mitakon to see if they could be a bit of a like cinema set, if you will. In terms of build quality, this thing's insanely small for an f1.2. It's got a clickless aperture ring at the front, which is kind of heavy to turn, which if you're going from inside to outside really quick, might be tough to do it quickly. On the other hand, it's not gonna get bumped by mistake and change your values without you realizing it. The focus ring is pretty smooth, nothing to write home about, but way better than any of those focus by wire lenses you'll find. We've got a distance scale, and generally this thing's pretty well put together. The lens cap is generic and pretty unremarkable. Next up, we've got the Voigtlander. As you can see, it's got a kind of fancy lens cap. It's bigger for sure. It's about probably twice as long and just a little bit thicker than this Mitakon lens. Again, it's built super well, super nice focus throw, maybe a little bit nicer just because you have so much further to turn it, a lot more precise. But then again, on the flip side of that, this might be a little bit better for run and gun single operator video use because the focus degrees is about 90 on this, and it's probably close to, I don't know, 300 or so on this, almost turning an entire length to go from minimum focus to infinity. The aperture ring is kind of the flip side of the Mitakon again as well, where the Mitakon was a little too heavy for me. The Voigtlander is a little bit loose, you know, you can change it really quickly, but it could also be pretty easy to knock out of the way. I'm not sure if I've ever done it, but I know some people have trouble with this. The lens caps are fine, and in general, I'd say if I had to pick one, I'm sure the Mitakon is slightly worse off when it comes to build, but the Voigtlander is just so nice that it's hard to compete. But honestly, they're closer than you might otherwise think. Another thing to note for build quality is the Voigtlander actually has non-curved aperture blades when it comes to stopping down, meaning you'll see in our later tests, the Bokeh will be a little bit more octagonal or stop sign shaped when the lens is anything under wide open. Whereas the cheaper lens, the Mitakon, actually has these really nice smooth transition between wide open and stopped down with these curved blades. I'm not sure of the number right off the top of my head. I'll put them on screen right there, maybe. But the Mitakon actually has better aperture blade assembly when it comes to smooth out of focus bokeh. Okay, let's get image quality out of the way with first. So the Voigtlander, wide open, has definitely a little softness, or at least it appears so. I think there's actually a pretty good amount of resolution there, but there's this really soft glow and ghosting around the edges of high contrast areas like the black letters on the white paper, and that gives the illusion of kind of a low resolution image. But underneath that, there's actually a little bit of sharpness to go around. The overall image is a little bit low contrast as well, and the corners do see a bit of a fall off. Going down to 1.4, you see there's a little color shift, but in general, the sharpness seems pretty markedly better, and the darkness in the corners has been pushed away a little bit. By f2, I would say the image is very good and looks totally fine. Darkness is almost totally gone, and at f2.8, it barely gets any better, but it is a slight improvement from 2 to 2.8 in every regard. And from 2.8 on, I think is pretty much the same, although when you get down to like f11 or 16, it's a lot softer. The Mitakon, as you can see, is a little bit more zoomed in, but yeah, it's kind of the same deal here. There's less contrast wide open than it will be later on. There's less resolution because of ghosting, and in general, it's just a little bit soft. Maybe even a little softer than the Voigtlander wide open. And those corners are pretty dark as well, which isn't surprising given how small the lens is. f1.4, there's hardly any difference, but f2, it's a little bit brighter in the corners, and there's some real resolution starting to come from this lens, although the corners are still just a little bit worse. And by f2.8, I think everything is looking really solid, and 4, you kind of reach the peak of this lens. So in general, I think the Voigtlander and the Mitakon look pretty darn good for most purposes around f2. The Voigtlander becomes pretty much perfect at f2.8, and the Mitakon becomes pretty much perfect at f4. All right, it's bokeh time. Starting with the Voigtlander, wide open at f.95. The bokeh is super smooth, super creamy. The only thing I could say is that around the edges it sort of cat's eyes a little bit, but in the center of the frame, the bokeh is super smooth and it gets the tiniest bit busy out towards the edges. The Mitakon wide open is pretty good as well. As you can see, it's not quite as out of focus as the Voigtlander since it's only at f1.2. And the bokeh here is a little bit busier here, looking down at the rocks at the bottom, looking at the bokeh balls in the background. There is a little bit of texture there from the glass elements being not quite as perfect. Stop the Voigtlander down to f1.2 as well, and you can see the bokeh is about the same size now, but the stop sign shape of the aperture coming in, those straight aperture blades, is already making the bokeh a little bit stop sign shaped, but in every other part of the image, other than the highlights that really show off those edges, it looks pretty good. Next, we've got the Mitakon at f2, and it looks kind of like a mess to me, honestly. It's not that bad, but compared to the earlier shots wide open, it's a little busy for sure. There's some specular highlighting around the edges of the bokeh balls, and you can still see that onioning sort of glass element effect. Moving on to the Voigtlander at f2, you can see the bokeh balls are a little bit smaller than the Mitakon for some reason. In terms of the quality, there's a little bit of highlighting on these as well. They're about as busy, but yeah, take your pick at this point. They're both looking a little rough. Stop down to f2. On to f4, the Mitakon has pretty much the same thing going, but just less bokeh in general. And the same with the Voigtlander. Although the Mitakon's out of focus backgrounds continue to be more out of focus, even down to f16, where you can see the Mitakon still has some depth all the way closed down, and the Voigtlander at f16 is pretty much completely everything in focus. So I'm pretty sure the focus markings on the Mitakon are not accurate. And while we're here at f16, we're going to take a look at focus breathing. The Voigtlander definitely zooms in a pretty decent amount when you're focusing, but it focuses way closer, so at normal distances, at normal apertures, it's not too big of a deal. The Mitakon also zooms in a pretty decent amount when you're focusing. I would say definitely more than the Voigtlander. Before we get totally off the topic of bokeh, let's look at some sort of medium distance bokeh shots where the out of focus backgrounds are not nearly as out of focus. Here you can see the Mitakon has a pretty painterly, brushstrokey sort of background. If you're being nice, if you're being mean, it's a little bit busy, honestly. And in the edges of the image, you can see something really kind of weird going on the very edge of the image. And I see this with my Mitakon 25mm as well. You get this like weird V curvy, highlighty, outliney, I don't know how to describe it, edge where the edges of the frame are super busy and weird. Some people might really like that kind of quirky look, but it's a little weird and distracting to me, honestly. The Voigtlander isn't exactly smooth at these medium distances, but I would say it handles things a little bit better than the Mitakon does. The edges are still a little busier, but the center is pretty smooth and there's less like highlighting and edging, and I don't know. It's not great either, but it's definitely slightly better or more pleasing in my mind than the Mitakon. The flare of the Mitakon is super wild. You got these blue elements, you got this giant rainbow that streaks across the image when the sun is in the frame or even just outside the frame, and it's just wild. When you close it down a little bit more, you get some broad flaring and some loss of contrast and some blue streaks, but it's definitely a little more tamed down. It's still pretty weak when it comes to a technically good performance against flare, but these are some pretty fun flares, I can't deny that, and you could use them in a really cool creative way. The Voigtlander honestly has a much more subdued flare than I thought it was. There's really only that one big hot spot in the middle, but the rest of the flares are just really soft green and red rings. They're definitely there, but wide open, they're so soft that they aren't super intrusive, honestly. Stopped it down a little bit more, and that green sort of washed out look is definitely a little more apparent, but yeah, it's not better or worse, it's just different, really. When it comes to close-up focusing, while the Voigtlander might be a little rough in the image quality department, producing an even more glowy effect than usual, the minimum focus distance is just over 9 inches, which is kind of insane for an 85mm lens equivalent. And as you can see, the Mitakon is a measly 1.48 feet, which is not nearly good enough for really small subjects. So there you have it, the kind of technical parts of these lenses. But, you know, I think a better question is which lens has more character? And if that's all you care about, the winner, I think, is the Mitakon. It's got a ton of quirks and weird stuff, and, you know, another word for character is flaws. And it's definitely not a perfect lens, but it can produce some really, really fun, fantastic images. The Voigtlander also has a bunch of character, but it's much more controlled. You can stop the lens down to produce an image that is very tamed down and more standard looking, or you can open it wide up and get all that character. I understand that character has a trade-off of optical perfection, and I think that's why most people prefer the Voigtlander, because it is a good balance between optical image quality and character. That being said, it is way more expensive, so if all you want is a fun lens for cinematography or other kind of video uses, I think the Mitakon might be better even. And you can get those for pretty cheap compared to the Voigtlander, which can be easily $600 to $1,000. But when it comes to just being a lens, I think the Voigtlander is clearly superior. It's got better image quality. It's got just as much character when you need it. It's got an insanely good minimum focus, even if the minimum focus image quality is pretty shaky. But the biggest thing for me as a cinematographer is it has 3 other lenses that you can match it with to create a set of lenses. And that's why the Mitakon disappointed me most, was because of the optical differences between it and the 25mm Mitakon 0.95. The aperture is different, the color is different. Some things match, some things don't. And that's a shame, because those 2 lenses could be a really powerful setup. But instead, I'm gonna end up going with the Voigtlander 42.5 and a couple others maybe in the future to round out that set. But if you want to introduce some character and a look to your images that can't be replicated with a LUT or an effect in post, then this Voigtlander lens and this Mitakon lens are both super interesting options. So there you have it, guys. I thought this was a cool way to kind of review 2 lenses at once, because it's kind of hard to review each lens in a vacuum. It's nice to pit it up against something else. I'm just glad we have so many awesome third-party lens manufacturers for Micro Four Thirds, giving us these really cool, fun, and relatively cheap optics when you look at, you know, the Pro, Panasonic, or Olympus lineup. If you found this video entertaining or helpful, please give me a like, and otherwise I'll see you in the next one.